Hello, everybody. In this post-election environment, we're looking for ways that we can defeat Trump. We're getting beyond the grief stage and beginning to recognize that the next 4 years are going to be politically challenging and interesting. My guest today on the show knows all about not just taking on Donald Trump, but beating him. Stephen Robinson is the author of Turf War: How a Band of Activists Saved New York from Donald Trump's Masterpiece. Stephen is joining us from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Stephen, congratulations on taking on Trump and beating him.
Thank you very much.
So tell us the story. What exactly happened?
Well, in late 1985, Donald Trump proposed a real estate development on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which would occupy the abandoned Penn Central Rail Yard, which spanned a half a mile of Hudson River waterfront. And that was our neighborhood. And it was a overwhelming proposal with 18.5 million square feet of luxury condominiums, a world headquarters for NBC, 9,000 car garage, and the largest shopping mall east of the Mississippi River, which essentially privatized that half mile of Hudson River waterfront. So some neighbors got together and said this was not appropriate, in fact, quite potentially damaging, both environmentally and socially, to our community. We started a nonprofit called West Pride and realized that we had to raise some money in order to fight a very prominent developer in the big city. And for 5 years, we hired environmental attorneys and environmental and land use lawyers, and made critiques of the proposal as it would have damaged the community, provided those critiques to the city of New York, which was evaluating the proposal. And after 4 or 5 years of this activism to try to protect our community, the city made a very bad mistake. The city of New York revised its own zoning resolution to diminish the environmental standards to which this development would be held. They changed the rules in the middle of the game. West Pride and others sued the city of New York. We prevailed, and the city had to stop reviewing the proposal because it had been written upon the assumption of these diminished standards. After we won the lawsuit and stopped what was then called first Television City and then Trump City, simultaneously, the civic groups in New York with whom we had joined forces, the Municipal Art Society, Parks Council, Riverside Park Fund, Regional Plan Association, and very importantly, Natural Resources Defense Council, designed an alternative plan for the site, which would provide a 21-acre park on the Hudson River with a continuation of Riverside Park to the north, and reduce the density, the size of the development, no regional shopping mall, no 9,000 car garage, and buildings that were contextually more appropriate for the community. And after losing after the city lost the lawsuit and Trump City was dead in the water, he asked us to a meeting, and at which he...
You mean Donald Trump himself? I'm not sure if you've seen the Apprentice, the movie this year about the same period. What was he like?
No, I have not seen the movie. Well, for the 5 years we were fighting the proposal, we weren't fighting him. We were fighting the proposal. and we never had any encounters with him and never had any desire or intention to, until he requested a meeting with us. And at that meeting, he capitulated. He's realized that he could no longer pursue his masterpiece, and he wanted to see our plan. And of course, he said he loved it and he wanted to build it. And then thereafter, there were some negotiations, and we formed a joint planning entity with Mr. Trump. And for the next year, we designed a master plan that was based on our vision of the property, not his. And it received city approval. And shortly thereafter, he sold the property.
So, Stephen, you're an architect rather than a political fellow, although obviously there's something very deeply political about what you did. Did you get the sense that, or do you have the sense that the Donald Trump now, who's about to become president once again of America, who seems a little demonic, is he a different Donald Trump from the one that you defeated? He was willing to acknowledge defeat in your meetings in the 80s.
Well, I wouldn't say that he acknowledged defeat, actually. What he said was that for years, his architects and his lawyers had been leading him down the wrong path. And finally, he now saw what the property.
It's classic Trump. He threw his advisors and lawyers under the bus.
Exactly. So no, I think that there is a tendency, indications of sociopathy that remain and have probably always been part of his character.
Stephen, I happen to be in New York right now, actually, as we speak, not too far from the Hudson Yards. When you look at Hudson Yards now, did what you most fear come into being? I mean, when you walk around there now, I'm not sure about the 9,000 car parking garage, but it just seems like a mega mall. Is what you fought somehow come into being in the 2020s?
Well, you're referring to the Hudson Yards, which is south of the Riverside South property.
Right, right.
Yes, I think that's exactly true. It is a result of the real estate development community gaining dominance in the city government and being able to get approved whatever they seem to want to build. And I think that consistent with that, there has been a diminution of creative advocacy for communities to fight for the ability to guide their own futures.
Yeah, this was supposed to be an uplifting conversation, Stephen. Now you're beginning to depress me. You took on Trump and beat him in the 80s, but then a non-Trump initiative kind of rebuilt his so-called masterpiece. What positively can we learn from turf war, both obviously in terms of standing up to Trump, especially on the environmental front, and then more broadly in terms of legal or political initiatives by local activists and organizations of one kind or another?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've just, put a point on it, because the reason that I wanted to write the book in the first place was to tell a story where community activists could get together and organize and actually fight for what they believed were the best interests of their community against all odds. It was a David and Goliath story. And so the reason I wanted to write the book was to say that it is entirely possible for ordinary citizens, some of whom have activist experience, some of whom don't, most of whom don't, but to take a leadership role in your community and have your voice heard, and that in fact it is possible to prevail, as we did. The other reason I wrote the book was I wanted to honor, pay tribute to so many activists and community organizers who participated in this very long and difficult struggle. And the third is to hopefully send the message, perhaps even inspiration, because this kind of excessive development proposal is happening all across the country. It's happening in cities and towns and rural areas where the deals for real estate development are being made between the landowner and the government. And the people who are most affected by it, the residents, rarely have a voice or a seat at the table. And the reality is that if you stand up and get organized, you can get a seat at the table and begin to guide the growth of your community rather than be a victim of other decisions.
It always seems to me that one of the catastrophic elements of all these commercial developments is they always look good when they go up. And then after a few years, for one reason or other, someone else builds a fancier one down the street, or one opens in another town up the road. They become ghost towns. Is that one of the dystopian elements of these commercial developments, Stephen?
Well, I think that when we talk about commercial developments, we were at the time particularly dealing with a mixed use development. It was a proposal that had residential, high-end luxury residential condominiums. It had office space proposal for NBC, and it had a very large retail component in that shopping mall. So I think it's difficult to generalize about the outcomes years later. Each one, I mean, for instance, office space, is not too valuable right now in New York City because so many people are working at home. And on the other hand, residential space is in great demand. So I think it's a difficult thing to generalize about.
Stephen, I'm from the Bay Area. A lot of criticism, particularly in Berkeley, where I've lived, of the not in my backyard movement of people being intrinsically, automatically against development. What do you make of that? Do some progressives have to acknowledge that not all development is bad?
Absolutely. There are thoughtful real estate developers. There are thoughtless real estate developers. The same is true of architects and lawyers and all other carpenters and electricians. I mean, there are people who get into their field and do it with a thoughtful, responsible approach. And so I think healthy growth, the places we live, our cities, our towns, our villages, are organisms. They're living organisms. And they can grow in healthy ways and they can grow in unhealthy ways. And when residents can perceive that the proposed development would be unhealthy for their community for a variety of reasons, maybe scale, maybe environment, maybe land use, maybe density, whatever it is, then there is what I think of as opportunity for intervention become an activist to protect your community. There is also real estate development that is healthy for a community so that communities grow and thrive and have more opportunities for more sectors of the population. So yes, I think that there is absolutely healthy growth for the organisms that are our communities.
Stephen, what are the models for cities or towns that are doing this right? I know you're in Santa Fe. I've heard some good things about it. Haven't visited it for a while. Certainly, San Francisco and the Bay Area are often cited as models where things aren't going quite right. What for you might be a city or a place or an initiative that reflects good development?
Well, I don't I don't see a lot of it happening in cities and towns around the country. I happen to be very proud of the fact that my son is working on a residential development up in Minneapolis, which is environmentally progressive and seems to be very well received by the community because of its location and its land use. So there are things like that that are happening around the country. I do remember that there were times when I was in Austin, Texas, and I said, "Wow, this small city really knows how to do it right." I understand that that has taken a negative turn in recent years with overdevelopment and gentrification. So I again, once again, I can't really point to a model. I know there was a time when Portland was doing some very, very healthy growth, but I understand that that has, made the community of downtown Portland very expensive. And
Yeah, I mean, huge problems of homelessness. You use this word gentrification. For some people, there's nothing wrong with that word. It just reflects the fact that people with money move into a neighborhood and build restaurants and stores and houses that people want. What's wrong, Stephen, with gentrification?
I think that their gentrification has a tendency to homogenize a community. And I think that urban life and village life thrives on diversity, not on homogenization. And so it seems to me that if a developer is proposing a residential project which would be exclusively high end, the government at the request or the demand of the community should require affordable housing within that development so that levels of diversity can be, if not exactly maintained as they were, at least continued on a relatively healthy level.
Is this the Jane Jacobs school of thinking about cities and architecture and homes?
Um, yes, I mean, the interesting thing about Jane Jacobs for me is that, people tend to think that Jane wanted everything to look like Greenwich Village, with vibrant street life, small scale, um, residential and locally owned, local serving businesses. And that, of course, is an ideal. But her uh, digging deeper into her thesis, it was that residents should participate in the growth of their communities to make them as consistent as possible with what they feel they want to live with, whatever that be, however, with the scale or the proportion or the dynamic or the architecture, that residents should if residents engage in the future of their communities will be better.
Um, Stephen, we've done a number of shows on housing in the US. Harris and even Trump, I think, acknowledged there was a housing crisis. As an architect, what are the challenges and opportunities for rebuilding new housing, particularly for people, the opposite, I don't know what word you would use, not the gentry, perhaps the working class or ordinary people?
Well, again, I think that these are not decisions that are solely made by architects or real estate developers. They're made largely by the governments that oversee the approval process in municipalities and cities. And so I think that the burden for maintaining or pursuing healthy communities lies very much with the government of that community, and the government of that community needs to be pushed and pressed and encouraged by the residents themselves.
Lots of debate, Stephen, as you know, about the meaning of Trump. Some people think he's a fascist, he's going to destroy democracy. I wonder, from your point of view, whether the fact that most of his life has been spent as a real estate developer, that might be perhaps the central feature of him, particularly in terms of his, I mean, I'm not sure he said build, baby, build, but he certainly said drill, baby, drill when it comes to oil. Is that the central ideology, this attempt to continually build and rebuild and profit from all that, and the thing that you took him on?
I'm sorry, are you speaking of him as an individual or as a trend in the
Both.
country?
I mean, his meaning in history. I mean, everyone says, oh, yeah, lots of people compare him to, I don't know, Mussolini or Hitler. I mean, sometimes I think these comparisons are a bit silly.
No,
But
I'm sorry. I am not terribly interested in him as a person. I am, his experience in the business world is not only in real estate development, it's in, gambling casinos, it's in television shows. So he apparently has chosen to diversify his interests wherever he saw it would serve his purposes. What I am more interested in is the consequence. The consequence being that there seems to be an acceptance in the United States right now of a kind of self-interest that produces what I perceive to be unhealthy consequences in a community. And in many ways, he represents that model and probably encourages it.
Stephen, Trump has spent millions, tens of millions of dollars hiring lawyers to fight his battles. You took him on the law front. Lots of debate now about Matt Gaetz as the new Attorney General. How central was the law for you? I mean, you're an architect, you're not a lawyer, but how reliant were you on the law in terms of taking Trump on?
Well, thank you. That's a great central issue in the book, in the story. When we started West Pride in 1986, two of the principal founders of this nonprofit were lawyers, and they were very experienced lawyers. They had experience in national movements like the Civil Rights Movement and the Women's Liberation Movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. These were lawyers who really knew how to engage the system. And then when we raised money and we hired environmental lawyers, these were young, aggressive, very skilled both in the environmental law and in the real estate development law. And then as we grew and brought on, became part of a bigger partnership of civic groups, the Natural Resource Defense Council, which you may know about, is
the NRDC. I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah, NRDC. Nationwide, international advocates for environmental health. And they're lawyers, and they're lawyers for the environment. So eventually, of course, as I said, what happened was we didn't end up prevailing because we proved the environmental and social problems that would have happened with Television City or Trump City. We won because we sued the city of New York legally. We won in a lawsuit. We we beat City Hall. And so if it were not for the continuing legal efforts, which I go into some detail about in the book, because that really was the core of our victory, was having the right legal advice, legal expertise to fight. In this case, it was fighting the city, but that was how we prevailed, was through the litigation.
Well,
And
Stephen, you're the guy who was an insider, at least, in this turf war. You saved New York from Donald Trump's masterpiece. What finally is your advice to people now gearing up to taking him on, particularly in the law courts, on the environmental front, particularly?
Did you say taking him on?
Well, taking his presidency on.
The word that is the title of the last chapter of the book is the power of intervention. And I think when residents become aware of something that they feel is a threat or problematic, whether it's environmental or social or political, whether it has to do with women's rights or environmental rights or immigrant rights, whatever kind of concern that a resident feels, very often what happens is that we get angry. We get angry because we feel that an injustice is being perpetrated. And as a result, from that anger, you can get organized. You can begin talking to your neighbors and to your colleagues. And then you form an opposition to what's going on and to what you perceive is an injustice. And that opposition then has to find a way to intervene, to get into the system. Throwing rocks from the outside rarely works. You've got to really understand how whatever system it is you're talking about, whether, as I said, whether it's the immigration system or whether it's the women's rights, women's health system, or whether, whether it's real estate, you make your presence felt through intervention. And through that intervention, you can have a positive impact on the future of whatever issue it is that concerns you and the health of the United States at large.
Wise and important words from Stephen Robinson, the author of Turf War: How a Band of Activists Saved New York from Donald Trump's Masterpiece. You beat Trump. Congratulations, Stephen. Congratulations on the new book. Thanks for the inspiration, and I hope others will learn from it. Thank you so much.